Before this story is over, tell me in the comments what you would have done if everyone around you kept walking. And subscribe so you do not miss the next story that may stay with you long after it ends. Because the strange thing about kindness is that it rarely announces the moment your life is about to change. The cold rain fell hard over downtown Sydney, turning the evening streets into rivers of reflected light, hurried footsteps, and choices people would rather not make. Hundreds of people moved past one another beneath umbrellas and glowing shop signs, each carrying their own worries, their own destinations, their own reasons not to stop. Charlotte Hayes pulled her thin coat tighter around herself as she stepped out of the cafe where she had just finished a 10-hour shift. Her feet ached. Her shoulders burned. The scent of coffee still clung to her hair. In her handbag sat a folded hospital bill she had read so many times that the paper was beginning to soften at the edges. Earlier that afternoon, her father had called from St. Vincent's Hospital. He had tried to sound cheerful. He always did. But Charlotte could hear the exhaustion beneath every word. The treatment was working slower than expected. More tests were needed. More appointments. More expenses. She had smiled through the entire phone call and promised him everything would be fine. The moment she hung up, she had gone back to serving customers with the same bright expression she wore every day. No one had noticed the difference. No one ever did. A gust of wind swept rain across the pavement as she reached the corner of George Street. Cars rolled through the intersection, their headlights glowing against the wet asphalt. Office workers hurried toward train stations. Tourists ducked beneath awnings. A delivery rider sped past with his insulated backpack bouncing against his shoulders. Then Charlotte heard it. Not a shout, not an alarm, just the soft sound of something hitting the ground. She turned instinctively. About 30 feet away, an elderly woman had collapsed beside a bus shelter. One shopping bag lay overturned beside her, apples rolling across the pavement. For a brief moment, people slowed down. They looked. They registered what had happened. Then they continued walking. Some glanced away awkwardly. Others pretended not to notice. Everyone seemed to assume someone else would help. Charlotte felt her stomach tighten. She looked at her phone. Her train home would arrive in less than 8 minutes. Missing it meant waiting nearly half an hour for the next service. She looked again at the woman lying motionless on the wet concrete. Then she started running. "Ma'am," she called as she knelt beside her. Rain dotted the woman's silver hair. Her face looked pale beneath the shelter lights. "Can you hear me?" The woman's eyelids fluttered but did not fully open. Charlotte quickly removed her coat and draped it over her shoulders. A young man standing nearby glanced over. "Should we call someone?" he asked uncertainly. Charlotte looked up. "Yes, an ambulance." The young man blinked as if surprised the responsibility had landed on him. Then he hurriedly reached for his phone. Charlotte gently held the woman's hand. It felt cold. "You're okay," she said softly. "Stay with me." The woman's breathing remained shallow. Minutes passed. Rain continued tapping against the shelter roof. People continued walking by. A few stopped briefly before moving on again. Charlotte stayed where she was. The woman opened her eyes. They were a striking shade of blue, filled with confusion. "Where am I?" she whispered. "You're safe," Charlotte replied. "Help is coming." The woman tried to sit up, but Charlotte stopped her. "Easy." A faint smile appeared on the woman's face. "You stayed." Charlotte frowned slightly. "Of course I stayed." The woman's expression softened as though that answer meant more than it should have. Several minutes later, the ambulance arrived. Paramedics quickly assessed the situation and prepared to transport the woman to the hospital. One of them asked if a family member was available. The woman slowly shook her head. No, the paramedic exchanged a concerned glance with his colleague. "We'll need someone to assist with admission details." Charlotte hesitated. She knew what she should do. She should catch her train. She should go home. She should save every dollar she could. Instead, she heard herself saying, "I'll come." The ride to the hospital felt longer than it was. Rain streaked across the ambulance windows while city lights blurred outside. The elderly woman drifted in and out of sleep. Whenever she opened her eyes, she seemed reassured to find Charlotte still there. At the emergency department, nurses moved efficiently through their routines. Forms needed completing. Questions needed answering. The woman remained weak and disoriented. Charlotte stayed beside her for nearly 2 hours. By the time everything settled, the hospital corridors had grown quieter. The woman finally looked at her properly. "You must have somewhere else to be." Charlotte smiled tiredly. "Not anymore." Most people wouldn't have done what you did tonight. Charlotte shrugged. Maybe they would. The woman slowly shook her head. No, most people would have kept walking. Then the woman reached for Charlotte's hand. What's your name? Charlotte Hayes. Thank you, Charlotte Hayes. Charlotte squeezed her hand gently. You don't need to thank me. The woman's eyes lingered on her face. There was something thoughtful in her gaze now. Something almost curious. Outside, the rain finally began to ease. Neither of them noticed the black luxury sedan that had just pulled into the hospital entrance, or the anxious man stepping out of the back seat, or the fact that by sunrise, the decision Charlotte had made on a rainy Sydney footpath would begin changing the course of her entire life. The man who stepped out of the black sedan looked as though he belonged to a different world from the one Charlotte knew. His tailored charcoal coat was darkened by the last traces of rain, and his expression carried the controlled tension of someone accustomed to solving problems before anyone else even noticed them. Ethan Calloway crossed the hospital entrance with long, purposeful strides. Nurses at the reception desk recognized him immediately, but he barely seemed aware of their greetings. His attention was fixed on one question. Was his mother all right? 20 minutes earlier, he had been finishing a board meeting on the top floor of Calloway Group headquarters overlooking Sydney Harbor. The meeting had involved numbers so large they hardly felt real anymore. Acquisitions, investments, expansion plans. Then his phone rang. The moment he heard the words hospital and mother in the same sentence, everything else ceased to matter. Now he stood outside her room while a doctor explained the situation. Fortunately, she received assistance quickly, the doctor said. Had she remained exposed to the weather much longer, things could have become more complicated. Ethan released a slow breath. Who found her? The doctor glanced down at the chart. A young woman named Charlotte Hayes. The name meant nothing to him, yet somehow he remembered it instantly. Charlotte Hayes. The doctor continued. She stayed with your mother the entire time. Rode with her in the ambulance. Assisted with admission paperwork. Ethan frowned slightly. Family friend. No, employee. No, the doctor shook his head. As far as we know, a complete stranger. Ethan looked through the small window in the hospital room door. His mother appeared tired but stable. Relief settled through him, followed almost immediately by curiosity. In his experience, strangers rarely invested hours of their evening helping someone they did not know. The doctor handed him a folder. Your mother asked us to make sure this was returned to the young woman if possible. Ethan opened it. Inside were several forms bearing Charlotte's signature. He noticed something else. A payment receipt. His eyes narrowed. Charlotte had covered expenses that should never have been her responsibility. Not a large amount by his standards, but enough to matter to most people, especially someone who worked in a cafe, according to the employment details listed on one of the forms. Ethan stared at the receipt for several seconds. Then he folded it and slipped it back into the folder. When he entered the room, Margaret Calloway smiled immediately. There you are. You gave me quite a scare. That was not my intention. Her voice remained gentle despite her obvious fatigue. Ethan pulled a chair beside her bed. How are you feeling? Embarrassed. That earned the smallest hint of a smile from him. Good. That means you are recovering. Margaret studied her son. At 38, Ethan had become one of Australia's most admired business leaders. Newspapers praised his discipline. Investors trusted his judgment. Competitors feared him. Yet in moments like this, she still saw the boy who once worried whenever she arrived 5 minutes late to pick him up from school. You should thank her, Margaret said softly. Ethan already knew who she meant. The young woman. Margaret nodded. Charlotte. The way she said the name caught his attention. You seem fond of her. I am. After one evening? Margaret looked toward the rain-speckled window. Sometimes one evening tells you everything you need to know about a person. Ethan did not answer immediately. He was not a man who believed easily in first impressions. His career had taught him that appearances could deceive. Promises could hide motives. Kindness could sometimes be calculated. Yet something about the facts bothered him. A stranger had sacrificed her own time, paid money she did not owe, remained until his mother was safe, then apparently left without asking for recognition. That part interested him most. Where is she now? He asked. Margaret smiled faintly. Home, I assume. Ethan nodded. The conversation drifted to other matters. Doctors, medications, follow-up appointments. Yet Charlotte's name lingered in the back of his mind long after the discussion ended. Across the city, Charlotte finally stepped off the train shortly after midnight. The station platform was nearly empty. Her muscles felt heavy with exhaustion. Every step seemed harder than the last. She checked her bank balance while walking toward her small apartment. The number on the screen made her stomach sink. Covering the unexpected hospital expenses had reduced what little buffer she had left. Rent was due soon. Her father's next appointment was scheduled for the following week. She had no idea how she would manage everything. But when she remembered the relief on Margaret's face after waking up, she could not bring herself to regret the decision. A warm light glowed through the front window of her apartment. Her neighbor, Mrs. Parker, had left a small container of homemade soup outside the door with a handwritten note attached. "Thinking of you. Eat something proper." Charlotte laughed despite her fatigue. The world could be difficult sometimes, but every now and then it offered reminders that kindness still existed. She carried the container inside, unaware that at nearly the same moment, several kilometers away, Ethan Calloway sat alone in his office holding the thank you card his mother had asked the hospital to forward. It contained only the details Charlotte had willingly left behind. A name, a phone number, a brief note written by a nurse, stayed until patient was settled. Nothing dramatic. Yet for reasons he could not fully explain, he read those words twice. Outside the towering windows, Sydney slept beneath clearing skies. Inside, one of the most powerful men in the country stared at the name Charlotte Hayes and wondered why a complete stranger had chosen not to walk away. Morning sunlight spilled across Sydney Harbor like liquid gold, but Charlotte barely noticed it. She was already halfway through her shift before most office workers had finished their first coffee. The cafe buzzed with the familiar rhythm of clinking cups, steaming milk, and hurried conversations. Normally, she enjoyed the energy. Today, exhaustion lingered behind her eyes. She had slept less than 4 hours. Every time she closed her eyes, she remembered the elderly woman in the hospital and wondered whether she was recovering well. She also remembered her bank balance. That thought stayed with her longer. Around 10 o'clock, her manager approached carrying a clipboard. "Charlotte, can I have a word?" His tone immediately made her uneasy. She followed him toward the back office. "You left early yesterday." She nodded. "There was an emergency." "I understand. But we were already short-staffed." Charlotte lowered her eyes. "I know. I am sorry." Her manager sighed. He was not an unkind man, merely a practical one. "I cannot keep covering shifts when people disappear. It will not happen again." He studied her tired expression for a moment before softening slightly. "Just try to keep things together, all right." Charlotte thanked him and returned to work. The conversation could have been worse. Still, it left a knot in her stomach. One unexpected problem could unravel everything she was trying so hard to hold together. Across the city, Ethan Calloway sat at the head of a polished conference table while senior executives discussed quarterly projections. Charts glowed across massive screens. Numbers filled the room. Yet his attention drifted repeatedly toward the folder resting beside his tablet. Charlotte Hayes. The file remained closed, but its presence irritated him. He disliked distractions. He especially disliked personal distractions. Yet every time someone mentioned employee engagement, community outreach, or corporate values, he found himself remembering the receipt she had paid at the hospital. Finally, during a short break, his chief assistant entered carrying fresh reports. "Your mother is asking when you plan to visit again." Ethan smiled faintly. "I was there last night." Apparently that was too long ago. He shook his head. "How is she?" "Much better." The assistant hesitated. "She also asked whether you found the young woman." Ethan looked up. "Found her? The one who helped her?" Ethan leaned back in his chair. "No, your mother seems convinced you should." The assistant left before Ethan could respond. Meanwhile, several kilometers away, Charlotte received a message from the hospital. Her heart jumped the moment she saw the notification. For one alarming second, she thought something had happened to her father. Instead, it was a simple update confirming his next consultation appointment. Relief washed through her so strongly that she nearly laughed. That evening, after finishing work, she took the train directly to the hospital. The corridors smelled faintly of disinfectant and fresh coffee. She found her father sitting beside the window of his room, reading an old paperback novel. His face brightened immediately. "There she is." Charlotte smiled. "How are you feeling?" "Better now that you are here." They spoke for nearly an hour. About doctors, about neighbors, about a television program neither of them particularly liked, but both continued watching. Her father studied her more carefully. You look tired. Long week. Charlotte. She laughed softly. All right. Very long week. His expression grew gentle. You spend so much time taking care of everyone else. Charlotte looked away toward the fading sunlight beyond the window. That is what people do for family. And who takes care of you? The question lingered between them. Charlotte had no answer. Later that evening, she left the hospital and walked toward the station. The air felt cooler than the previous night. Traffic moved steadily through the streets. A violinist played beneath a pedestrian overpass, the music echoing through the evening crowd. Charlotte dropped a few coins into the open case before continuing on her way. She never noticed Ethan stepping out of the hospital entrance on the opposite side of the street after visiting his mother. He had not gone there to look for Charlotte. In fact, he had spent most of the afternoon telling himself that one stranger's kindness should not occupy so much of his attention. Yet as he waited for his driver, he saw her stop to help an elderly tourist understand directions to the station. Then she paused to speak kindly with the violinist beneath the overpass. None of it appeared performative. No cameras. No audience. No opportunity for recognition. Just small acts of consideration offered naturally. Ethan frowned slightly. He had spent years studying people, negotiating with them, evaluating them. Most revealed their motivations sooner or later. Charlotte remained difficult to categorize. The traffic light changed. She disappeared into the station entrance. Ethan remained where he was for another moment before returning to the car. For reasons he could not yet explain, he suspected this would not be the last time their paths crossed. And somewhere inside St. Vincent's Hospital, Margaret Calloway sat comfortably in her bed, smiling to herself as though she already knew something neither of them had discovered yet. 3 days passed, and life settled back into the familiar rhythm Charlotte knew too well. Early mornings, long shifts, hospital visits, careful calculations at the kitchen table each night as she tried to stretch every dollar a little further. Yet beneath the routine, something felt different. She could not explain it. Perhaps it was the memory of that rainy evening refusing to fade. Or perhaps it was the strange feeling that a chapter of her life had ended while another waited just out of sight. Saturday arrived with clear blue skies and the kind of sunshine that made Sydney sparkle. The harbor reflected brilliant streaks of light, and families filled the parks and waterfront paths. Charlotte spent the morning serving customers before finally finishing her shift shortly after noon. As she untied her apron, her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. She almost ignored it. Almost. Hello. Miss Hayes. The voice belonged to a woman. Professional. Warm. Yes. My name is Claire. I am calling on behalf of Mrs. Margaret Calloway. Charlotte froze. For a second, she wondered if she had heard correctly. The lady from the hospital? Yes. Relief immediately replaced concern. Is she all right? The woman laughed softly. She is doing very well. In fact, she insisted I contact you. Charlotte leaned against the counter. Why? Mrs. Calloway would like to see you again. She asked whether you might be available for afternoon tea tomorrow. Charlotte blinked. Afternoon tea? At her home. The request sounded so unexpected that Charlotte almost thought it must be intended for someone else. That is very kind, but I do not want to intrude. You would not be intruding. She was very clear about that. Charlotte hesitated. She still needed to visit her father. She still had errands to run. Yet something in Margaret's voice during their brief hospital conversations had reminded her of her late grandmother. Gentle, genuine, impossible to refuse. All right, she said finally. I would be happy to come. After ending the call, Charlotte returned to work feeling oddly nervous. She knew almost nothing about Margaret except that she seemed kind and well-spoken. She certainly did not know anything about her family. Meanwhile, in a corner office overlooking Circular Quay, Ethan stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows while reviewing documents. His assistant entered carrying a tablet. Your mother invited Charlotte Hayes for tea tomorrow. Ethan closed his folder. I suspected she might. Should I be concerned? About what? About whatever your mother is planning. Ethan almost smiled. If my mother has a plan, concern is usually justified. The assistant laughed. Should I arrange anything? No. Ethan turned back toward the harbor. Let her enjoy herself. Yet after the assistant left, he found himself thinking about the invitation. His mother rarely formed quick attachments. The fact that she continued speaking about Charlotte suggested something deeper than simple gratitude. The next afternoon arrived bright and warm. Charlotte stood outside her apartment staring at her wardrobe. The problem was not choosing what to wear. The problem was that she owned very little to choose from. She selected a simple pale blue dress and brushed her blonde hair into soft waves. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive, just presentable. When the rideshare vehicle stopped outside the address Claire had provided, Charlotte nearly asked the driver if there had been a mistake. The property overlooked a stretch of waterfront lined with jacaranda trees. The home itself was elegant without being flashy, surrounded by maintained gardens bursting with color. Charlotte stared through the window for several seconds before stepping out. A staff member greeted her warmly and guided her through the entrance. Everything felt refined yet comfortable. Family photographs decorated shelves. Fresh flowers brightened nearly every room. The atmosphere felt surprisingly welcoming. Then she heard a familiar voice. Charlotte. Margaret stood near the terrace doors, smiling. She looked dramatically better than she had in the hospital. Color had returned to her cheeks. Her eyes sparkled with energy. Charlotte immediately smiled back. You look wonderful. I feel wonderful. Margaret opened her arms and embraced her. The gesture surprised Charlotte, but she returned it warmly. They spent the next hour talking over tea and homemade scones. The conversation flowed naturally. Margaret asked about Charlotte's father, her childhood, her dreams. Charlotte answered honestly without revealing just how difficult recent years had become. She preferred not to burden others with her problems. At one point, Margaret studied her quietly. You know, most people spend their lives trying to impress others. Charlotte laughed softly. I have never been particularly good at that. No, Margaret agreed. You are good at something much rarer. Before Charlotte could ask what she meant, movement near the terrace caught her attention. A tall man had just stepped through the garden entrance carrying a phone in one hand. He wore a simple navy shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan stopped walking. Charlotte looked up. Their eyes met across the terrace, and something unspoken seemed to pass between them before either knew why. For a moment, the sounds of the garden seemed to fade into the background. The distant call of seabirds from the harbor, the rustle of leaves in the afternoon breeze, even the soft clink of teacups on the terrace table all became strangely muted. Charlotte recognized him immediately, not because they had ever been introduced, but because she had seen his photograph before. Business magazines displayed near the cafe register. News articles customers occasionally left behind. Interviews playing silently on television screens. Ethan Callaway, the founder and chief executive officer of one of the most successful companies in Australia. The realization hit her all at once. Margaret Callaway, Ethan Callaway. Suddenly, every detail fell into place. The elegant home, the staff, the confidence with which everyone seemed to move around the property. Charlotte stood slowly from her chair. Ethan recovered first. Charlotte Hayes. His voice was calm and measured. It is nice to finally meet you properly. Finally, the word caught her attention. You know who I am? A faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. My mother has spoken about little else for the past several days. Margaret looked entirely pleased with herself. That is true. Charlotte felt warmth rise to her cheeks. I hope only good things. Very good things, Margaret said. Immediately, Ethan walked toward the terrace and took a seat across from them. Unlike the polished public figure she expected, he seemed surprisingly relaxed here. Less guarded, more human. I wanted to thank you personally, he said, for helping my mother. Charlotte shook her head. There is no need. There is. His tone remained gentle but firm. The doctors told me everything. She looked down at her tea. Anyone would have done the same. Ethan exchanged a brief glance with his mother. Margaret almost laughed. You continue insisting that. The evidence suggests otherwise. Charlotte did not know how to answer. Fortunately, Margaret redirected the conversation. Soon they were discussing ordinary things. Favorite places in Sydney. Books. Local cafes. Family traditions. To Charlotte's surprise, Ethan participated naturally. He listened more than he spoke, but when he did contribute, his observations were thoughtful and often unexpectedly humorous. The hours passed faster than she anticipated. As the afternoon sunlight shifted across the garden, Charlotte found herself forgetting entirely that she was sitting with one of the country's wealthiest men. She enjoyed the company. At one point, Margaret excused herself to take a phone call inside. The moment she disappeared, Charlotte had a sudden suspicion. She was being left alone intentionally. Ethan seemed to have the same thought. My mother is not subtle, he said dryly. Charlotte laughed. I was beginning to notice. The shared amusement eased whatever awkwardness remained between them. They watched the harbor beyond the garden wall. Boats drifted across sparkling water. Children played in a nearby park. The city skyline rose in the distance beneath a cloudless sky. She likes you, Ethan said finally. Charlotte smiled. I like her too. That is not easy to accomplish. You make her sound intimidating. She can be. Charlotte pretended to consider this. I do not believe you. Ethan laughed quietly. It was a genuine sound, warm and unguarded. Charlotte realized she had probably never seen that version of him in any interview. What about you? She asked. What about me? Are you intimidating? His expression became thoughtful. According to most people, yes. And according to you? He looked toward the harbor. I think I spend too much time working. The honesty surprised her. Most successful people she encountered preferred polished answers. This one felt real. My father says people who work too much eventually forget why they started working in the first place. Ethan turned toward her. And is your father usually right? Unfortunately, yes. They both smiled. The conversation might have continued much longer if Charlotte's phone had not suddenly vibrated. The moment she saw the hospital number, her stomach tightened. She answered immediately. Ethan noticed the change in her expression. Hello. She listened silently. Yes, of course. Thank you for letting me know. When the call ended, concern lingered in her eyes. Is everything all right? Ethan asked. My father's specialist appointment has been moved forward. That sounds positive. It is. But there are additional tests they want completed. She tried to smile. Nothing to worry about. Yet Ethan sensed the strain beneath her words. Margaret returned just in time to hear the final part of the conversation. How is your father doing? She asked. Charlotte explained the situation. Margaret listened carefully. You must be proud of him. I am. Charlotte's voice softened. He spent his whole life looking after me. Now it is my turn. Neither Margaret nor Ethan missed the sincerity in those words. It was the same quality they had both noticed from the beginning. Loyalty without expectation. Kindness without performance. As the afternoon drew to a close, Charlotte prepared to leave. A driver had already been instructed to take her home, despite her polite objections. At the front entrance, Margaret embraced her warmly. You will visit again. It sounded less like a question than a decision. Charlotte laughed. I would like that. Then she turned toward Ethan. Thank you for today. Thank you for coming. Their eyes met briefly. Neither spoke for a moment. Then Charlotte stepped into the waiting car and disappeared down the tree-lined drive. Ethan remained standing beside the entrance long after. The vehicle had vanished from sight. Margaret observed him carefully. Interesting. What is? You are still watching the road. Ethan glanced at his mother. You are imagining things. Margaret smiled knowingly. Perhaps. But as she walked back inside, she carried the unmistakable feeling that fate had begun arranging pieces neither of them fully understood yet. The following week arrived with the kind of relentless pace that left little room for reflection. Charlotte threw herself into work, determined to focus on practical concerns rather than lingering thoughts about the Callaways. Bills still needed paying. Her father's medical appointments still filled her calendar. Life had not suddenly become easier because she had spent an afternoon overlooking Sydney Harbor with one of the most influential families in the country. Yet despite her efforts, reminders seemed to appear everywhere. A newspaper headline featuring Ethan Callaway sat abandoned on a cafe table. A customer discussed a recent Callaway Group announcement while waiting for coffee. Even Margaret sent a cheerful message asking how her father was feeling after his latest consultation. Charlotte found herself smiling more often than she expected. On Thursday afternoon, however, reality returned with uncomfortable force. She had just finished her shift when her phone rang. It was the hospital. By now she recognized the number immediately. Her pulse quickened as she stepped outside onto the footpath. Hello. The specialist spoke kindly but directly. Additional testing had revealed that her father would benefit from a new treatment program. The news itself was encouraging. The problem was timing. The treatment needed to begin soon. Charlotte listened while costs and schedules were explained. By the end of the conversation, she thanked the specialist and slowly lowered the phone. Traffic moved steadily along the street. Pedestrians hurried past carrying shopping bags and takeaway coffees. The entire city seemed to continue normally while her thoughts raced in every direction at once. The treatment could help her father significantly. She knew that, but she also knew the financial reality. Even with careful budgeting, she was already stretched close to her limit. For several minutes, she stood silently beneath the awning outside the cafe. Then she took a deep breath and started walking toward the train station. Worry would not solve anything. It never had. That evening, she visited her father and deliberately avoided discussing money. Instead, they talked about cricket, neighborhood gossip, and a documentary he had recently watched. He studied her face with familiar suspicion. "Something is bothering you." Charlotte smiled. "You always say that." "Because I am usually right." She laughed softly. "The doctors are optimistic." "That is good news." "It is." Her father nodded slowly. "Then why do you look like someone carrying the weight of the harbor bridge?" Charlotte looked away toward the window. She hated worrying him. More than that, she hated how easily he could still read her emotions. Before she could answer, he reached across and squeezed her hand. "We will figure things out." The simple certainty in his voice nearly brought tears to her eyes. Instead, she smiled and squeezed his hand back. Across the city, Ethan was attending a charity foundation meeting that should have commanded his full attention. The room was filled with respected community leaders discussing educational grants and health initiatives. Normally, he appreciated these conversations. Tonight, his concentration drifted. During a break, his mother called. "You sound distracted," Margaret observed immediately. Ethan stepped toward the window overlooking the city lights. "Busy." That was not an answer. He smiled despite himself. "And you sound curious." "I am curious." A brief silence followed. Then Margaret asked, "Have you spoken with Charlotte recently?" Ethan glanced out at the traffic below. "No, interesting." "Why?" "Because she received difficult news today." Ethan's expression sharpened slightly. "What kind of news?" Margaret explained what she knew about Charlotte's father and the upcoming treatment. Nothing confidential. Only the concerns Charlotte had shared during a message exchange earlier that afternoon. By the time the conversation ended, Ethan found himself staring thoughtfully through the glass. He remembered the hospital receipt she had paid without hesitation for someone she barely knew. He remembered the way she spoke about her father. He remembered every small act of kindness he had observed. Most people asked for help when life became difficult. Charlotte seemed determined to carry every burden herself. The next morning, Charlotte arrived at work to find an envelope waiting beside the register. No postage, no return address. Her name appeared neatly on the front. Confused, she opened it carefully. Inside was an invitation printed on elegant cream stationery. The Callaway Foundation was hosting a community development forum the following week. Selected guests were invited to attend a special networking and scholarship event connected to the program. Charlotte read the invitation twice, then a third time. At the bottom of the page, a handwritten note appeared in familiar script. "I hope you will join us. Warm regards, Margaret." Charlotte smiled despite everything. She did not yet realize that accepting the invitation would place her directly in the path of an opportunity far greater than anything she could currently imagine. Nor did she know that several floors above Sydney's financial district, Ethan Callaway was already considering a decision that might alter both of their lives in ways neither of them expected. The invitation sat on Charlotte's small kitchen table for 3 days before she finally decided what to wear. Every time she passed it, she felt the same mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. The Callaway Foundation event was clearly designed for professionals, community leaders, and people who moved comfortably through worlds she had only ever seen from a distance. She was a cafe employee with overdue bills and a father facing expensive medical treatment. She still could not understand why Margaret seemed so determined to include her. On the evening of the event, Sydney glittered beneath a clear autumn sky. The venue occupied the upper levels of a modern waterfront building overlooking the harbor. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected thousands of city lights across the water below. As Charlotte stepped from the lift, she immediately felt underdressed despite choosing the nicest outfit she owned. Men in tailored suits discussed investment projects. Women in elegant dresses exchanged business cards and introductions. Waitstaff moved gracefully through the crowd, carrying trays of sparkling water and canapes. For a moment, Charlotte considered turning around and leaving. Then she heard a familiar voice. "I was beginning to think you had changed your mind." Margaret approached with a warm smile and immediately took Charlotte's hands in hers. Relief flooded through Charlotte. "I almost did." Margaret laughed softly. "I am very glad you did not." Within minutes, Margaret was introducing her to people from various charities, educational programs, and community organizations. Charlotte quickly discovered that Margaret possessed a rare gift. She made every person feel important. More surprisingly, she spoke about Charlotte with genuine admiration. Several times Charlotte found herself blushing as Margaret described the rainy evening that had first brought them together. Across the room, Ethan watched the interactions quietly. He had arrived early for a series of meetings connected to the foundation. Yet despite dozens of important guests filling the venue, his attention repeatedly drifted toward Charlotte. She seemed unaware of the effect she had on people. Unlike many attendees who promoted their achievements, Charlotte asked questions and listened attentively. She remembered names. She showed interest in stories. She made strangers feel comfortable. It was a quality Ethan rarely encountered. "You are staring again." His mother's voice appeared beside him. Ethan did not look away immediately. "I am observing." "Of course you are." Margaret's smile widened. "That sounds much more professional." Before Ethan could respond, the evening program began. Guests gradually moved toward the main presentation area. A series of speakers discussed upcoming community initiatives, educational grants, health partnerships, regional development projects. Charlotte listened carefully, impressed by the scale of the foundation's work. Many of the programs focused on helping families facing difficult circumstances. The subject felt unexpectedly personal. During a short intermission, she wandered toward one of the display exhibits highlighting scholarship recipients from previous years. Photographs lined the walls. Stories of resilience and opportunity filled each panel. She was studying one particular display when a familiar voice spoke beside her. "What do you think?" Charlotte turned. Ethan stood nearby holding 2 glasses of sparkling water. He offered one to her. "Thank you." "You did not answer the question." Charlotte glanced back toward the display. "I think it is remarkable." "Why?" "Because someone decided to notice people who might otherwise be overlooked." Ethan considered her words carefully. "That matters to you?" "Very much." Her gaze remained on the photographs. A lot of people work incredibly hard and still struggle. Sometimes all they need is one opportunity. Ethan found himself thinking about her father, about medical bills, about the difficult reality she faced every day without complaint. "And if you were given an opportunity?" he asked. Charlotte laughed softly. "I would probably spend half my time wondering whether there had been a mistake." Ethan smiled. At least that would be honest. Their conversation continued naturally. They spoke about family, responsibility, and the strange ways life could change direction without warning. Charlotte discovered that Ethan possessed a dry sense of humor hidden beneath his public image. Ethan discovered that Charlotte challenged assumptions without even trying. Neither noticed how much time passed. An announcement called guests back toward the main hall. As they walked together, Charlotte felt unexpectedly comfortable beside him. Not because of his success, not because of his reputation, simply because he seemed genuine. The final presentation of the evening focused on a new initiative the foundation planned to launch. As the speaker explained the concept, Ethan's attention shifted toward the audience, specifically toward Charlotte. A thought that had been forming over the past several weeks suddenly became much clearer. The foundation needed leaders who understood compassion beyond theory, people who connected naturally with those facing hardship, people whose kindness existed even when nobody was watching. By the time the applause ended, Ethan had made a decision. He did not know how it would unfold. He only knew that the path ahead now seemed impossible to ignore. And as Charlotte stood among the crowd watching the harbor lights shimmer beyond the glass, she remained unaware that one conversation, one decision, and one extraordinary opportunity were already moving steadily toward her future. The morning after the foundation event felt strangely ordinary. Charlotte woke before sunrise, prepared breakfast, checked on her father through a quick phone call, and caught the train into the city just as she had done countless times before. Yet beneath the familiar routine, a quiet sense of anticipation lingered. She told herself it was because the previous evening had been enjoyable. Nothing more. By 8 o'clock, she was back behind the cafe counter serving commuters rushing toward offices and meetings. The scent of freshly ground coffee filled the air. Orders were called out. Cups clinked against saucers. Life moved forward at its usual pace. Around mid-morning, an elderly customer accidentally dropped a small paper bag while reaching for her wallet. Several oranges rolled across the floor. Before anyone else reacted, Charlotte stepped around the counter and helped gather them. The woman smiled gratefully. You always seem to appear at the right moment. Charlotte laughed. I have had a lot of practice chasing runaway fruit. The woman left smiling. Moments later, one of Charlotte's co-workers shook her head. You know, most people would have just pointed and gone back to work. Charlotte shrugged. It took 30 seconds. That is my point. The comment stayed with her longer than she expected. Across the harbor, Ethan sat through a strategy meeting while reviewing proposals connected to the Foundation's newest initiative. The project aimed to expand community outreach programs across several regions of New South Wales. On paper, everything looked promising. Funding models, operational structures, recruitment plans. Yet something felt incomplete. He remembered Charlotte standing beside the scholarship displays. He remembered her saying that sometimes all people needed was one opportunity. Most proposals discussed numbers. Very few discussed people. After the meeting ended, Ethan requested additional information about several community-facing leadership roles connected to the project. His executive team appeared surprised. Usually those decisions were delegated. This time he wanted personal involvement. Meanwhile, Margaret watched events unfold with growing amusement. She had lived long enough to recognize subtle changes. Ethan was spending more time discussing community programs than quarterly profits. He asked questions about Charlotte without appearing to ask questions. Most telling of all, he seemed unaware of his own behavior. Late that afternoon, Charlotte finished her shift and headed directly toward the hospital. Her father's latest tests had been completed, and she wanted to hear the results in person. The journey felt longer than usual. By the time she arrived, nervous energy had settled heavily in her chest. She found him sitting beside the window, looking brighter than he had in weeks. You look worried, he said immediately. I inherited that from you. Then I apologize. She laughed and pulled a chair closer. The consultation itself brought encouraging news. The specialist believed the new treatment plan offered strong potential benefits. For the first time in months, genuine optimism entered the conversation. Charlotte listened to every detail. She asked questions, took notes, clarified schedules. Yet when costs were mentioned again, she felt her stomach tighten. Her father noticed. Of course he noticed. He always did. Once the specialist left, he studied her quietly. You are thinking about the money. Charlotte looked down at her notes. I am thinking about solutions. Same thing. She smiled faintly. Maybe. He reached across and touched her hand. Charlotte, promise me something. What? If someone offers help, do not reject it because you are proud. The words caught her off guard. I am not proud. You are as proud as I was at your age. She opened her mouth to protest, then stopped. Because he was right. That evening, after leaving the hospital, Charlotte walked slowly through a nearby park before heading home. The sky glowed orange and pink above the city skyline. Families gathered around picnic tables. Children chased one another across the grass. A young boy struggled to carry a box of donated books toward a community center entrance. Without thinking, Charlotte crossed the path and helped him. The task took less than 2 minutes. The boy thanked her enthusiastically before hurrying away. Charlotte smiled and continued walking. She never noticed Ethan standing near the opposite side of the park after visiting a nearby community project supported by the foundation. The moment he saw Charlotte helping the child, he paused. Not because the act itself was extraordinary, because it was ordinary for her. There were no cameras, no introductions, no audience, just another small kindness offered instinctively. As Charlotte disappeared into the evening crowd, Ethan stood silently for several moments. The decision forming in his mind no longer felt uncertain. Some people impressed others through achievements, some through influence. Charlotte impressed people through character. And increasingly, he was beginning to believe that was what the foundation needed. 2 days later, Sydney woke beneath a blanket of soft gray clouds that drifted slowly across the harbor. Charlotte stood at the kitchen counter reviewing her monthly budget for what felt like the 10th time. Numbers filled a notepad beside her coffee mug. Rent, utilities, groceries, transport, medical expenses. She moved figures around repeatedly, searching for a solution that refused to appear. Every calculation ended the same way. There was not enough. The specialist remained optimistic about her father's treatment. That should have been the only thing that mattered. Yet hope carried a cost she could not ignore. Her phone vibrated with a message from Margaret. How is your father feeling today? Charlotte smiled despite herself. Better. He is pretending he does not need rest. Some things never change. A reply arrived almost immediately. That sounds familiar. Ethan used to do the same thing. Charlotte laughed softly. Over the past several weeks, exchanging occasional messages with Margaret had become one of the brightest parts of her day. The older woman possessed a gift for making people feel valued. She never offered empty sympathy. She listened. She remembered details. She cared. Later that afternoon, Charlotte arrived at the hospital carrying a small container of homemade soup. She found her father sitting beside the window, reading glasses balanced on the end of his nose. "You are smiling," he observed immediately. "That is encouraging. Maybe I am just happy to see you." "Nice try." He set aside his book. "Something good happened." Charlotte hesitated. "I have made a few new friends recently." "Oh." His expression brightened knowingly. "The waterfront mansion people." Charlotte rolled her eyes. "That is not what I call them." "Perhaps you should. It is memorable." They spent the next hour talking comfortably. Yet as the conversation continued, her father noticed moments when her attention drifted. Finally, he asked the question she had been avoiding. "How worried are you?" Charlotte looked down. "About what?" "The treatment." Silence answered for her. Her father nodded slowly. "I thought so. I just want everything to work." "It will." "You do not know that." "No," he admitted gently. "But I know you." The simple statement caught her off guard. "What does that mean?" "It means you have spent your whole life finding a way forward whenever things looked impossible." Charlotte blinked rapidly and looked away toward the window. Outside, rain had begun tapping against the glass. Across the city, Margaret Calloway sat in a quiet meeting room reviewing foundation reports. Yet her attention remained elsewhere. Specifically, on a conversation she had shared with Charlotte the previous evening. The young woman had never directly complained about financial pressure. She rarely spoke about herself at all. But Margaret had lived long enough to recognize strain hidden behind optimism. By the time the meeting ended, she had reached a decision. That evening, she invited Charlotte to join her for a casual lunch later in the week. Charlotte accepted immediately, grateful for the opportunity to spend time with someone she genuinely admired. The lunch took place at a quiet waterfront cafe overlooking the marina. Sailboats rocked gently against their moorings while sunlight danced across the water. For the first half hour, they discussed ordinary things. Books, family stories, favorite places around Sydney. Then Margaret became more serious. "May I ask you something personal?" Charlotte nodded. "Of course. Why did you never tell me how difficult things have become?" Charlotte stared at her cup. "Because everyone has problems." "That is not an answer." Margaret's voice remained kind. "It is the only one I have." Then Charlotte finally admitted the truth. Not dramatically, not emotionally, simply honestly. She explained the treatment schedule, the costs, the uncertainty, the constant balancing act of trying to support her father while maintaining everything else. Margaret listened carefully. When Charlotte finished, the older woman reached across the table and touched her hand gently. "You carry far too much by yourself." Charlotte smiled faintly. "I am managing." "Yes," Margaret said softly. "That is what worries me." The conversation shifted soon after, but something had changed. For the first time, Margaret fully understood the scale of what Charlotte was facing. And for the first time, Charlotte allowed someone else to see it. Neither woman noticed Ethan crossing the street after a nearby foundation appointment. Through the cafe window, he briefly saw his mother and Charlotte sitting together like family. He did not stop or interrupt. He continued on his way, but the image stayed with him. Laughing, talking, trusting one another completely. Later that night, after reviewing documents related to the Foundation's new initiative, Ethan opened a folder that had remained on his desk for several days. Inside was a proposal for a leadership position connected to community outreach and charitable engagement. He studied the description carefully. Then he picked up his phone. "Schedule a meeting next week," he told his assistant. "With whom?" Ethan looked toward the city lights beyond his office. Window. Charlotte Hayes. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while Charlotte was restocking takeaway cups behind the cafe counter. The lunch rush had finally eased, leaving only the soft hum of conversation and the occasional hiss of the espresso machine. She wiped her hands on her apron and glanced at her phone when it vibrated. The number was unfamiliar. Normally, she would have let it go to voicemail. Something made her answer. "Hello. Miss Hayes." The voice belonged to a woman. Calm. Professional. "Yes. My name is Claire Bennett. I work with Calloway Group. Mr. Ethan Calloway would like to invite you to a meeting next Thursday morning. Charlotte blinked. For a moment, she wondered whether she had misheard. A meeting? Yes. With Mr. Calloway? That is correct. Charlotte stared at the wall across from her. Several thoughts collided at once. Had something happened to Margaret? Had she accidentally done something wrong? Was there some charity event she had forgotten? May I ask what the meeting is about? She said carefully. Mr. Calloway would prefer to discuss that in person. That answer created even more questions. I see. Would 10 o'clock suit you? Charlotte hesitated. Yes. Wonderful. We will send the details shortly. After the call ended, she remained standing motionless for several seconds. One of her co-workers noticed immediately. You look like someone just told you they bought the opera house. Charlotte laughed nervously. Nothing like that. Yet the rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. Every time she thought about the upcoming meeting, uncertainty returned. Ethan was one of the busiest people in the country. Why would he want a private meeting with her? By evening, she still had no answer. The next day brought no clarity, nor did the day after. When Thursday finally arrived, Sydney greeted the morning with bright sunshine and cool harbor air. Charlotte stood in front of her wardrobe longer than she cared to admit. She selected a simple cream blouse and navy skirt, professional without appearing as though she were pretending to be someone else. Before leaving, she visited her father at the hospital. You are dressed differently, he observed immediately. Big day. Charlotte smiled. Maybe. That sounds mysterious. It feels mysterious. After explaining the invitation, she expected him to be surprised. Instead, he nodded. Good. Good. Very good. You do not even know why I am meeting him. No, her father smiled knowingly. But life rarely sends invitations by accident. An hour later, Charlotte stood in the lobby of Calloway Group headquarters. Sunlight streamed through towering glass walls. Executives moved purposefully across polished floors. The entire building radiated confidence and success. Charlotte suddenly felt very aware of her modest background. A receptionist greeted her warmly and directed her toward a private lift. Moments later, the doors opened onto the executive floor. Claire Bennett met her personally and guided her through a quiet corridor lined with modern artwork. Mr. Calloway is expecting you. Charlotte's pulse quickened. Claire opened a set of doors and stepped aside. Ethan stood near the windows overlooking Sydney Harbor. The view stretched for kilometers beneath a brilliant blue sky. He turned as she entered. Charlotte, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for coming. He gestured toward a seating area away from his desk. The choice immediately put her more at ease. This felt less like a formal corporate meeting and more like a conversation. After a few moments discussing her father and Margaret, Ethan became more serious. There is something I would like to show you. He handed her a folder. Charlotte opened it carefully. Inside were documents outlining a major community outreach initiative connected to the Calloway Foundation. She scanned the pages. Educational support programs, family assistance networks, community partnerships. The project was ambitious, meaningful, exactly the sort of work she admired. This is incredible, she said honestly. Ethan watched her reaction. I agree. She continued reading. Then she reached a page describing a newly created leadership role. Her eyes widened slightly. Community engagement coordinator? Yes. Charlotte looked up. That sounds like a significant responsibility. It is. You would have a senior, mentor, training, and a small team around you. Whoever gets that position will have the opportunity to help a lot of people. Ethan nodded. That is the idea. Charlotte smiled and returned her attention to the folder. Several seconds passed before she noticed Ethan had not looked away. A strange feeling settled in her chest. Slowly, she lowered the papers. Why are you showing me this? For the first time since she arrived, Ethan's expression softened completely. Because I would like you to consider it. Charlotte stared at him. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Me? Yes. She laughed once in disbelief. There must be some mistake. There is not. Ethan, I work in a cafe. You also understand people. His voice remained calm. You listen. You care. You show up when others walk away. I have watched that happen more than once. Charlotte struggled to find words. Nothing in her life had prepared her for this moment. Outside the windows, ferries crossed the harbor beneath the morning sun. Inside the office, everything she believed about her future had just begun to change. Charlotte stared at him as though the words had arrived in a language she did not fully understand. For several seconds, she sat there holding the folder while the city stretched beyond the glass behind him. Ferries crossed the harbor. Sunlight flashed across the water. Somewhere below, thousands of people moved through their ordinary Thursday morning. Yet inside the office, everything felt suspended in place. "I am not qualified," she said finally. Ethan did not seem surprised by the response. "Why do you believe that?" "Because people in positions like this usually have degrees, experience, and entire careers built around nonprofit leadership." "Some do. Most do." Ethan nodded slightly. "That is why this role comes with training, supervision, and room to grow. But many experienced people still struggle with the one thing that cannot be taught." Charlotte looked down at the folder again. "Which is genuine concern for people." She shook her head. "That is not enough. It is where everything begins." His voice remained calm, patient. "The technical aspects can be learned. Systems can be taught. Procedures can be explained. Character is different." Charlotte felt overwhelmed by the conversation. A week ago, she had been worrying about train fares and medical invoices. Now she was sitting in one of the most influential offices in Australia, discussing a leadership role she had never imagined possible. "Why me?" she asked quietly. Ethan leaned back slightly. The question seemed important to him. "Do you remember the night you helped my mother?" "Of course. You stayed with her for hours. She needed help. You paid expenses that were not your responsibility. It felt like the right thing to do." Ethan gave a small nod. "Exactly." Charlotte frowned. "I still do not understand. Most people would have expected recognition. Some would have expected a reward. You expected nothing." He paused briefly. "Then I watched what happened afterward." Her confusion deepened. "Watched?" Ethan smiled faintly. Not in a dramatic way. "That does not sound reassuring." For the first time, genuine amusement appeared in his eyes. "Fair point." The tension eased between them. "I noticed how you treat people," he continued. "The hospital staff, your coworkers, complete strangers. The way you speak about your father. The way you listen when someone else is talking." Charlotte lowered her gaze. Compliments always made her uncomfortable. Those seem like ordinary things. They should be. Ethan's expression softened. "Unfortunately, they are not." Silence settled between them. Not awkward. Thoughtful. Charlotte found herself remembering all the small moments of recent weeks. Helping Margaret. Visiting her father. Carrying books for a child at the community center. None of those actions had felt remarkable. They had felt natural. She looked up again. "And your mother agrees with this?" A smile immediately appeared. "She was convinced before I was." That answer made Charlotte laugh despite herself. "That sounds like Margaret." "It does." Ethan stood and walked toward the windows. After a moment, Charlotte joined him. Sydney stretched beneath them in every direction. The harbor shimmered beneath the midday sun. "When I started my company," Ethan said quietly, "I believed success was mostly about intelligence and hard work." Charlotte listened. "Then what changed?" "Life." His reflection appeared faintly in the glass. "The older I get, the more I realize that organizations succeed because of people, not because of strategies." He turned toward her. "The foundation helps thousands of families. But if we want to do more, we need leaders who understand what those families are actually facing." Charlotte thought about medical appointments, financial pressure, long nights spent worrying about someone she loved. For the first time, she began to understand what he was saying. Not completely, but enough to see the shape of it. "You really believe I could do this?" she asked. "Yes." The answer came without hesitation. That certainty affected her more than she expected. She could not remember the last time someone had expressed such complete confidence in her future. Her father always believed in her. Margaret cared deeply about her. But this felt different. It felt like someone seeing potential she had never allowed herself to imagine, and offering her a door she was terrified to open. A soft knock interrupted the moment. Claire entered carrying a folder. "Sorry to interrupt. The board meeting begins in 15 minutes. Ethan nodded. "Thank you." After Claire left, he looked back at Charlotte. "You do not need to decide today." Relief immediately crossed her face. "Thank goodness." Ethan laughed quietly. "Take your time." "I will." He handed her the folder. "Review everything. Ask questions. Challenge assumptions. Then tell me what you honestly think." Charlotte accepted it carefully. As she prepared to leave, another thought suddenly occurred to her. She stopped near the door. "Ethan." "Yes." "If I say no?" For a moment he studied her. Then he smiled. "My mother will probably spend months trying to change your mind." Charlotte laughed. "That sounds accurate." As for me, he continued, I will respect your decision. The sincerity in his voice reassured her. She nodded and thanked him once more before leaving the office. Yet as she rode the lift toward the ground floor, clutching the proposal against her chest, she carried a feeling she had not experienced in a very long time. Hope, not the cautious kind she used when discussing treatments or budgets. Something bigger, something brighter. And far above the city, standing beside the window of his office, Ethan watched the lift numbers descend and realized that regardless of what choice Charlotte ultimately made, she had already begun changing far more than a foundation project. For the next several days, the proposal rarely left Charlotte's side. She carried the folder to work, brought it to hospital visits, and read through every page again late at night after the city had gone quiet. The more she studied the initiative, the more she understood its potential. Families struggling with medical expenses, young people needing educational opportunities, community organizations operating with limited resources. The work mattered deeply, yet every time she imagined herself leading such a project, doubt returned. On Sunday afternoon, she sat beside her father's hospital bed with the folder resting on her lap. Sunlight streamed through the window, casting warm patterns across the floor. Her father noticed the documents immediately. You are reading that thing again. Charlotte smiled. Maybe. That usually means you already know the answer. I'm not sure I do. He adjusted his glasses and held out his hand. Let me see it. Charlotte passed him the folder. For several minutes, he read quietly, occasionally nodding, occasionally raising an eyebrow. When he finally looked up, his expression carried a mixture of pride and amusement. And you are considering saying no? Charlotte shifted uncomfortably. I do not know if I am the right person. Interesting. What? You never questioned whether you were the right person to help a stranger in the rain. She opened her mouth to respond, but stopped. That is different. Why? Because that was simple. Was it? He closed the folder gently. Helping someone is never simple. It is a choice. His words lingered long after the conversation moved on. Later that evening, Charlotte received a message from Margaret inviting her to dinner. Nothing formal, just family. The invitation alone made her smile. By now, spending time with Margaret felt natural, comfortable, like reconnecting with someone she had somehow known for years. The dinner took place at the waterfront home where everything had changed. As the sun set over Sydney Harbor, soft golden light spread across the terrace. Margaret greeted Charlotte warmly and immediately insisted she sit beside her. Ethan arrived shortly afterward, having come directly from a business trip. He looked tired but genuinely pleased to see both women. During dinner, conversation flowed easily. Stories were shared. Laughter came naturally. Yet Charlotte sensed an unspoken awareness beneath the surface. Both Margaret and Ethan knew she was still deciding. Neither mentioned it directly. Eventually, after dessert, Margaret excused herself with suspicious timing. I suddenly remembered several emails. Ethan watched her disappear inside. Several emails? Charlotte laughed. That might be the least convincing excuse she has ever used. You have not known her long enough. The harbor lights shimmered across the water as silence settled comfortably between them. Finally, Ethan looked toward her. How are you feeling about the proposal? Charlotte considered the question carefully. Inspired. That sounds promising. Terrified. Ethan laughed quietly. That sounds more honest. She smiled. I keep thinking there must be someone more qualified. There are thousands. The answer surprised her. That is not very encouraging. Let me finish. His expression softened. There are thousands with more experience, more credentials, more impressive resumes. He paused briefly. There are not many with your perspective. Charlotte looked out across the harbor. I am not sure perspective is enough. Neither am I. She turned back toward him. What? No one ever knows they are ready before they begin something important. His voice remained calm. When I started my company, I had no certainty, only conviction. The honesty caught her attention. Public interviews always portrayed confidence. This felt different. Real. You were afraid? She asked. Constantly. She stared at him. I do not believe that. Most people do not. They both smiled. For a few moments neither spoke. The evening air carried the scent of salt water and flowering jacaranda trees. Somewhere in the distance, a ferry horn echoed across the harbor. Whatever you decide, Ethan said eventually, I want it to be your decision. Not mine. Not my mother's. Charlotte nodded slowly. Thank you. For what? for trusting me before I trusted myself." The words escaped before she could overthink them. Ethan seemed genuinely moved by the answer. "You earned that trust." Later that night, after returning home, Charlotte sat alone at her kitchen table. The proposal rested in front of her. Beside it sat a photograph of her and her father from years earlier. She studied both for a long time. Then she remembered something her father had once told her when she was young. Opportunities rarely arrive looking like certainty. Most arrive disguised as risk. Slowly, Charlotte opened her laptop. She began drafting notes, ideas, questions, plans, the first outlines of what the initiative could become. By the time midnight arrived, the uncertainty had not disappeared completely, but something else had grown stronger. For the first time, she was no longer imagining why she might fail. She was imagining what might happen if she succeeded. 1 year later, the ballroom overlooking Sydney Harbor glowed with warm light and quiet anticipation. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished floors while guests filled the room with conversation and laughter. Community leaders, business executives, educators, and families from across New South Wales had gathered to celebrate a milestone few could have imagined 12 months earlier. On a large screen near the stage, photographs appeared one after another. Scholarship recipients standing proudly beside university acceptance letters. Families receiving support during medical crises. Regional programs opening doors for young people who once believed opportunities existed only for someone else. The initiative had exceeded every projection. More importantly, it had changed lives. Charlotte stood backstage reviewing her notes for what felt like the 100th time. She no longer wore a cafe apron. She no longer spent late nights wondering how she would stretch every dollar far enough to cover another bill. Yet in many ways, she felt the same. The responsibility she carried now was larger. The stakes were higher. But the reason behind every decision remained unchanged. People mattered. A staff member approached with a smile. "They are ready for you." Charlotte nodded and took a slow breath. As she stepped toward the stage entrance, her eyes drifted toward the front row. Her father sat there, healthy enough to attend in person. The treatment program had worked beyond expectations. Color had returned to his face. Strength had returned to his voice. For the first time in years, the future no longer felt uncertain whenever she looked at him. Beside him sat Margaret Calloway, elegant as always and visibly proud. She caught Charlotte's eye and gave a small encouraging nod. Then Charlotte noticed Ethan. He stood near the side of the room, speaking with several guests. Even from a distance, there was something different about him. Perhaps it was because she knew him now beyond newspaper headlines and business awards. She knew the man who called his mother every day. The man who stayed late reviewing scholarship applications personally. The man who believed character mattered more than credentials. Their eyes met briefly across the room. He smiled. Not the controlled smile often seen in public photographs. The real one. The same smile she had come to value more than she ever expected. Moments later, Charlotte walked onto the stage as applause filled the ballroom. For a second, memories flashed through her mind. A rainy Sydney footpath. An elderly woman collapsed beside a bus shelter. A decision that had taken only seconds to make. At the time, she had believed it was an ordinary act. Looking back now, she understood that some ordinary moments reshape entire lives. The room gradually fell silent. Charlotte stepped toward the microphone. "A year ago," she began, "I believed opportunity belonged to other people." Gentle laughter moved through the audience. She smiled and continued. "I thought extraordinary things happened somewhere else, to someone else. Then I learned something important. Sometimes a single act of kindness creates consequences we cannot possibly predict." Her gaze moved across the crowd. Families, students, volunteers, donors, people whose lives had become interconnected through compassion and opportunity. This initiative has never been about funding alone. It has never been about titles or organizations. It has always been about people choosing not to walk away when someone needs help. Near the front, her father wiped away a tear. Margaret reached over and squeezed his hand. Charlotte continued speaking for several minutes. Not about herself. About the families who found support when they needed it most. About students who discovered possibilities beyond their circumstances. About communities strengthened because someone decided they were worth investing in. When she finished, the audience rose to its feet. The applause seemed endless. Charlotte felt overwhelmed, grateful, humbled. After the event concluded, guests gathered throughout the ballroom exchanging stories and congratulations. Charlotte finally slipped away toward the terrace overlooking the harbor. The evening air carried the scent of salt water and summer blossoms. City lights shimmered across the dark water. "You were remarkable." Ethan's voice came from behind her. She turned and smiled. "Thank you." For a moment they stood side by side looking out across the harbor. Neither seemed in a hurry to break the comfortable silence. "Do you remember what you asked me in my office?" Ethan said eventually. Charlotte thought for a moment. "You may need to be more specific. You asked what would happen if you said no." She laughed softly. "I remember." Ethan nodded toward the ballroom behind them. "I am very glad you did not." Charlotte looked out at the water again. "So am I." The city sparkled beneath the night sky. Ferries moved slowly across the harbor. Somewhere in the distance, music drifted through the warm evening air. A year earlier, she had been worried about catching a train home after helping a stranger. Now she stood surrounded by people whose lives had changed because kindness had been given a chance to grow. Sometimes destiny did not arrive with grand announcements. Sometimes it appeared on a rainy evening and asked a simple question: "Will you stop and help?" Charlotte had answered yes. And in doing so, she discovered that the greatest rewards in life rarely come from what we receive. They come from the lives we choose to touch along the way. So the next time the world rushes past someone who needs help, remember Charlotte Hayes. One kind choice can become the first chapter of a life you never saw coming.